Again, we'll start on the defence debt rules.
Sure.
Oliver, thank you for speaking to us for the World in 10. Can you just explain to us why this debt rule change in Germany is such a landmark decision?
It's a huge moment in two senses. First of all, because it's just huge. What we're talking about here is about €500 billion for infrastructure spending, and then probably a similar amount that will be spent on defence. Although what they're really doing is lifting all restrictions on defence spending, so it's theoretically unlimited. So this could be a package of upwards of €1 trillion. It's the kind of money that could be completely and utterly transformative, not just for Germany's defence, but also for Europe's. And it's so large that when the package was announced, you could see the borrowing costs of other countries in the eurozone rising because the markets expected this to have such a massive kind of gravitational pull to it.
And this vote is partly on defence, but also on German infrastructure. Do we have a sense of how much of it will be going towards defence as opposed to updating roads and railways and all that sort of thing in Germany?
So you've got two separate pots of money. You've got the €500 billion that is earmarked for infrastructure. Some of that infrastructure may be of military use. For example, the railways, in particular, are very dilapidated, but also things like bridges that need to be strengthened or motorways that need to be expanded. But the defence budget has effectively no ceiling on it. Beyond, so the first 1.5% of GDP that they spend on defence will count towards their kind of normal borrowing limits, and then beyond that, they can borrow as much as is politically possible and as much as the bond markets will tolerate. And there are various assessments out there of how much money that will be in total, but most of them cluster around something like €400 billion to €600 billion. And to put that into context, the regular German annual defense budget is about €50 billion. So we are talking, anything from 8 to 12 times their annual military spend.
And do you get a sense that from the bond markets and I suppose the political climate that there is going to be more leeway for Germany to spend big sums of money on defence because for so long it has been so fiscally conservative?
Yeah, well, there has been a consensus among most economists everywhere except Germany for a long time that it's extremely kind of puritanical approach to public borrowing has been a massive drag on not just the German economy, but neighboring economies that are very exposed to it. And it's created a huge deficit of investment, particularly, but not only in the armed forces, that has really led to consequences that are quite dramatic in the present. Um, Sorry, remind me what the question was again. Oh man.
I'm muting myself. I'm muting myself.
Okay,
It's my problem. Germany for so long has been fiscally conservative. It's got this constitutional rule that it's now changed. Do you think that that conservatism gives, say, the political climate you were talking about, or the bond markets, which will now kind of dictate how limitless that budget is? Do you think that will mean that they give German politicians more leeway to spend big on defence?
Yeah, so German government bonds have traditionally been the safe haven par excellence for European institutional investors. And what we saw after the kind of outline of the package was first announced was that uh, the borrowing cost on a sort of benchmark 10-year bond rose by about 0.4 percentage points, from about 2.5 to just under 3%, which is, in marginal terms, pretty much what we saw after Liz Truss's mini budget. So it is a big shift, but at the same time, Germany's borrowing costs still remain well below those of Britain and most other European countries. So for the time being, it looks like the markets have swallowed this shift and remain persuaded that Germany has a lot of fiscal space. And when you think that its debt to GDP ratio is about 62, 63%, compared to nearly 100 in Britain and well over 100 in France and Italy. You can certainly see why the investors regard it as a safer bet than its European neighbours.
Merz was very clear that Friedrich Merz, being the man who's still likely to be the next German chancellor, he was very clear that this is because of Vladimir Putin that this is needed. It was pretty explicit in that.
Well, what Merz said was that it wasn't just Vladimir Putin, it was Trump. On the night after his Christian Democratic Union Party won the Bundestag election, Merz appeared on television and said, and these are really extraordinary words to hear from any German political leader, but particularly to hear from a person who's been such an absolutely staunch Atlanticist for so many years as Merz has, that Germany can no longer unreservedly count on America and its security guarantees, and that it should help Europe as a whole take steps towards becoming actually independent of the US.
Germany obviously has a complicated history with militarization, with armies, with wars. And that came out in these debates, didn't it? I mean, Merz was accused of bringing Germany back to 1914, just before the First World War, and of those rising war loans that accumulated in the years before that.
That's correct. This was brought up by the Sapper-Wagenknecht Alliance, which is a kind of mixture of radical left and radical right. And one of the fringe parties that is very much tapping into the part of the German electorate that remains staunchly pacifist and anti-militarist. However, that pool of voters is a lot smaller than it was before February 2022. And there has been a tremendously dramatic shift in the German public's attitude towards the military and towards rearmament in particular, to the point where about 2/3 of voters believe Germany should be spending at least 3% of its GDP on defense. I mean, those are crazy numbers. If you've been in Germany before 2022, you would have struggled to believe they were possible. And this metamorphosis has been so pronounced that even the Alternative for Germany party, which is very kind of sympathetic to the Putin regime, felt obliged to support rearmament in its manifesto ahead of the Bundestag election. So that shows you just how much the political climate has shifted.
For years, Germany's been spending less than 2% of GDP on defence, that being the sort of the NATO target for years. And now it's sort of creeped above that figure. Will Donald Trump, do you think, be pleased that Germany's taking this move, or will he just see it as, well, Germany's finally doing what I think they should have been doing for years before, and actually it won't get Germans the credit that they might hope from the US?
Sadly, I have no special insight into the inner workings of Donald Trump's mind, and if I did, I would not be sitting in a flat in Berlin. I would be on a trading floor on Canary Wharf, raking in billions of pounds in stock options. It's hard to tell because on the one hand, Trump clearly has a particular animus against Germany, and that has not gone away since Angela Merkel, his previous favourite punchbag, has retired from the German political stage. And Trump has also been pushing for European NATO allies to spend 5% of their GDP on defence. And however much political will there is to transform the German armed forces, Germany is still very far from being in a position where it's politically possible to reach 5%. On the other hand, if Trump is in a mood to big up his own achievements and to say, look what I've done, the fact that he has taken Europe's most notorious laggard on defense spending and shaken it by the collar to the point where it's now prepared to cough up something in the region of 3+% could certainly be chalked up as a win for the Trump administration. So I think it will just come down entirely to his caprices on any particular day, how he perceives this.
And If Europe is going to forge a new defence community that's separate from the US, which it sounds like Friedrich Merz is sort of proposing here, are we going to assume that Germany is actually now going to be at the heart of that, having been, as you say, a laggard for many years? And I suppose how significant would that be if that turns out to be the case?
One of the key parts of Merz's promise to the German electorate was to put Germany back on the map of Europe after a period where it had largely abdicated its traditional leadership role under Olaf Scholz, the outgoing chancellor. And a key part of that is going to be making Germany a big security player again. And Merz doesn't want to do that alone. He's very keen to do it in tandem with the other three big military players, which are France and Poland within the European Union and Britain outside it. And if you're watching this kind of ever shifting constellation of European countries that have been coming together since J.D. Vance's notorious speech at the Munich Security Conference, the constant has always been that these four countries are in the room. They very much regard themselves as being the engine room of the solution. And we've seen all kinds of interesting steps from Britain and from France and from Poland suggesting that it might pursue a nuclear weapons program of its own. But so far, Germany has been absent in terms of constructive policy proposals. And what I think we can take away from the signals Merz is sending out ahead of his kind of prospective tilt for the chancellorship is that he would very much like to put Germany in the driving seat alongside those three countries.
On the budget rules, we'll now switch over to the F-35 piece, and we'll try and do it so that it's as if we haven't had the conversation just now. Forgive me if I slip into some question that reflects that. Perfect. So you've written a piece about a supposedly secret contract or a secret clause in the German contract to buy F-35s. You talk about a kill switch in the F-35s that America have sold to Germany. How does that kill switch, quote unquote, work? I mean, are planes literally going to drop out of the sky if the Americans did it?
Just to be clear, in the piece, I didn't say there was a kill switch. In fact, I don't think there is a kill switch, and the British military and defence establishment are very insistent that there is no kill switch. What we are talking about here is two slightly different things. The first of which is this deep suspicion among many of the European allies that have bought the F-35 or ordered it that the US doesn't need a kill switch, that it can simply cut off the spare parts and the software updates to the F-35s, much as it did with things like the targeting systems on the HIMARS rocket launchers in Ukraine, and that would sufficiently compromise the F-35s as to make them effectively unusable or to seriously jeopardize their combat effectiveness. And the second thing is that, according to Stern magazine's assessment of the previously very, very strictly classified German contract ordering 35 F-35 Lightning IIs from America, the US has reserved the right to veto any sortie that it feels might compromise American national interests. And that doesn't have to involve a kill switch. That could simply be a kind of political process where Washington says, you do not have our authorization for this mission.
Forgive me putting two and two together and getting 25 there. This contract sort of shows how much control the US still has over weapons that not only that they've, say, donated in the case of Ukraine, but that other countries have bought. Why is there that level of control that the US?
So the exact terms under which the US sells its most advanced weapon systems are very obscure. And from what I can gather, they vary a lot from country to country. And in this particular case, it's possible that the US has imposed particularly strict conditions on Germany because the point of these F-35s is that they are there to carry American nuclear bombs that are stationed on German soil if there's a crisis. So you can understand, in a sense, why the Pentagon is so sensitive about how these jets might be used. But more broadly, the reason why there appears to be so many restrictions on how allies can use the F-35, and in particular things like how they can inspect the code and how they have to bring in American technicians to service the jets, is that they are basically computers with wings. And aside from the kind of virtues of the airframe, it's the software that really makes the F-35 in particular. You know, the kind of radar systems and the electronic warfare modules. And you can definitely see why the US would be protective about that, and why it wouldn't let just any ally do whatever it wanted with that code.
It's so interesting when you mention that, because I think to the layman, you think of a plane, however high tech it is, ultimately it's a bit of hardware, it's a bit of kit that you or me or whichever pilot steps into the seat can physically control. How much of a choice do allies have in terms of buying this equipment now that is essentially all interconnected, and your jet that's sitting on your runway is actually connected in some way to a server or to a base or a computer somewhere in the US or anywhere else in the world? I mean, is that just the nature of modern warfare now?
It's a really, really good question, and I think it's on two levels. There's a very simple aspect to the question, which is if you are a European government that is sitting on an order for F-35s and is thinking about cancelling it, or wondering whether to order them in the future, you have to ask yourself, okay, if I don't trust the Americans, then what are my realistic alternatives? Because the F-35 is pretty much the only fifth generation fighter jet on the market, to my knowledge, and they could reach for less sophisticated alternatives such as the French Rafale or the kind of multinational European Eurofighter, but those are older jets with lower performance specifications on the whole. Um, but then the broader thing about how much choice you have about whether to accept the terms the Americans set if you do order the F-35s, again, really hard to tell because we can't see these contracts. But from what I hear from analysts, it seems to depend on your leverage as a buyer. And there will be allies that are better trusted and have more bargaining power with the Americans, which might include the British, for example. And there will be those that really don't. And in particular, I think that the Germans are in a very delicate position because they basically had to buy these F-35s in order to maintain their nuclear sharing arrangement with the US.
Let's dig into some of the other countries that are affected, or I suppose which other countries are affected, because, as you say, it's not just the Germans.
That's correct. There are, I think, about 20 countries that have bought or ordered F-35s so far. And they are mostly, but not exclusively, NATO allies. So you also have countries like Japan, Australia, Korea on the list of customers. Um, and some of them, in the light of what happened in Ukraine, are expressing publicly very serious reservations about whether they still want to buy the F-35s to fulfill their orders. So the particular cases that have been very public recently have been Canada, which is currently subject to threats of an American invasion, and Portugal, where the government has just collapsed and which is facing a snap election. So there are kind of special political circumstances in each case, but they are far from the only allies that are kind of privately very worried about how all of this fantastically sophisticated American kit they bought might be a security vulnerability in extremis.
And there are fears from some European politicians that the US could use this as a bargaining chip, as leverage in separate discussions.
Yeah, one of the scenarios that has caused me a lot of lost sleep is one where the US and Russia strike some kind of deal along the lines that Putin demanded at the end of 2021. that would involve the withdrawal of American forces behind what were previously NATO's borders before 1997, which means Poland, or at least large parts of Poland, certainly all three of the Baltic states, and other parts of the eastern flank are left without an American forward presence. And then Russia tries to exploit that sort of not exactly a vacuum, but certainly that weakened security position for the frontline states. And the Americans say, well, hold on, don't make any sudden moves, because if you do, you saw what happened to the Ukrainians when they crossed us, and you wouldn't want all of your rocket launchers and your intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance systems to suddenly go blind, would you? And that would be potentially a very powerful tool of leverage. And I know from conversations with various European officials that although they're very reluctant to admit to this kind of thing publicly, it is something that is exercising their minds too.
You touched on it a bit earlier. How do you think this will affect orders of US equipment from allies? Will there be this push for European production? And I suppose, frankly, is there any way for Europe to compete with that? This technology must take years to produce.
I think it really depends on the weapons system. So, as I said earlier, in terms of kind of really high level fighter jets, this is a field where the US has an overwhelming technological advantage, and there might be reasons why you would choose to buy an F-35, even knowing what we know about the kind of potential vulnerabilities that it brings with it, just because it is the best thing available. And there are NATO allies that are continuing to put in orders for American kit. In particular, the Estonians lately have been thinking about trying to procure some more HIMARS multiple rocket launch systems, despite their targeting software having been cut off by the Americans in Ukraine. However, there are very serious concerns in the American defense industry that this unpredictability is a kind of serious drag on their ability to sell things in future to the Europeans, especially if those things are very dependent on software updates. And there's certainly a lot of bullishness in the European defense industry that they can kind of move in. And we've also seen this week the European Commission publishes white paper on defense, which, among other things, sets out this 150 billion euro pot of money for investments in European Union and European Economic Area countries' defense procurement. So there's definitely a sense in which this has really kind of put the willies up everyone. And people will certainly be thinking twice about ordering American kit, but whether that will stop them from ordering American kit entirely, I very much doubt.
And just finally, Oliver, it all feeds into the strained relationship at the moment between Donald Trump's United States and Europe and wider allies. Do you think this is more cause or symptom of that strained relationship at the moment?
Sorry, which is more cause or symptom?
I suppose this the German newspaper reports about what America could or could not allow Germans to do with their F-35s, wider worries more broadly about how the Trump administration may use it as leverage. Do you think this would be a problem without the already strained relationship with Donald Trump, or do you think this is something that causes anxiety regardless of the US president?
I don't think this would be a significant problem were it not for the steps that we have seen the Trump administration take over the past couple of months, because the entire setup of NATO, and we're not just talking the purchases of American armaments here, we're also talking how the alliance processes military intelligence and where that intelligence comes from, and its command structures, which are overwhelmingly reliant on high-ranking American officers. And that entire edifice is built on 75 years worth of hard-won trust that the US has a deeply founded belief that Europe's security interests are its security interests too. And what Trump has done is effectively not just cast grave doubt on that premise, but also given indications that the US is in some fields hostile towards Europe. And that has raised the question, which is extremely awkward and which I haven't yet seen any European leader grapple with seriously in public, of how on earth you could start to disentangle the American presence from these structures if you wanted to. And I think in the intelligence and command and control systems, that is, if anything, an even deeper problem than it is in relation to weaponry.